The town of Oak Haven, Michigan, is the kind of place that exists on the periphery of the modern world, a lakeside community defined by the rhythmic cycle of the seasons and the heavy, damp silence of the surrounding Manistee National Forest. In the winter of 2014, that silence became something much heavier. It was a Tuesday evening, February 11th, when the routine of the town was fractured by a detail that seemed, at first, like a simple oversight. Elias Thorne, a 32-year-old technician for the local power company, had not returned home from a routine inspection of a substation near the county line. The evening was typical for a Michigan winter aesthete, light snowfall and temperatures hovering just below freezing. But the scene found by a passing motorist 3 hours after Elias was last heard from defied the logic of the local landscape. His utility truck was found parked on the shoulder of a secondary logging road, the engines still humming and the heater blowing at full blast. The driver's side door was swung wide, allowing the interior of the cab to be coated in a fine layer of crystalline snow. On the passenger seat sat Elias's thermal thermos, still warm to the touch, and his cell phone, which was vibrating with a missed call from his wife. There were no signs of a struggle, no skid marks on the ice, and no blood. There were only his footprints, leading away from the truck for exactly 12 paces before they simply ended in the middle of the road, as if the person making them had ceased to exist. To understand why the disappearance of Elias Thorne sent such a profound tremor through Oak Haven, one has to understand the man himself. Elias was not a man given two flights of fancy or erratic behavior. He was a creature of deep, almost mechanical habit, a man whose life was measured in the maintenance of the grid and the quiet upkeep of his family's small farmhouse. He had grown up in the shadow of the Great Lakes, the son of a commercial fisherman who had taught him that the environment was something to be respected, never underestimated. Those who knew him described Elias as grounded a man who carried a multi-tool on his belt and a spare tire in his trunk. Someone who looked at the world through the lens of repair and stability. His job as a high-voltage technician required a level of precision that dictated his personality. He was methodical, cautious, and deeply aware of his surroundings. He had married his high school sweetheart, Sarah, and together they were raising a 7-year-old daughter who Elias walked to the bus stop every single morning without fail. There was no debt, no history of substance abuse, and no indication that he was anything other than a man satisfied with the quietude of a rural life. However, in the weeks leading up to that February night, Sarah would later tell investigators that Elias had developed a singular, quiet preoccupation. It wasn't a change in mood, but rather a change in his sensory awareness. He began complaining about a persistent, low-frequency hum that he claimed to hear in the house at night. He spent hours in the basement and the attic, checking the wiring and the foundations, convinced that something was vibrating at a pitch he couldn't quite isolate. He even brought home specialized acoustic equipment from work to try and find the source. When he found nothing, he didn't become frustrated. Instead, he became strangely observant, often standing on the back porch for long stretches of time, staring into the dense wall of pines that bordered their property. He told Sarah it wasn't a noise anymore, it was a feeling, like the air was thinning out. It was a comment she dismissed as the exhaustion of a man working long hours in the Michigan winter. But it was a detail that would later haunt the investigative files of the Blackwood County Sheriff's Department. The environment of northern Michigan in midwinter is its own character in this story. The Manistee National Forest is nearly 1 million acres of dense timber, seasonal wetlands, and ridges that have remained unchanged for centuries. In February, The humidity from Lake Michigan creates a heavy, wet snow that clings to the bark of the hemlocks and deadens all sound. To get lost here is not a matter of miles, but of minutes. Yet Elias Thorne was a man who knew these woods as well as he knew the layout of his own living room. He carried a GPS, a satellite radio, and emergency flares in his truck. He was the person people called when they were lost. His background in the electrical grid meant he understood the topography of the region through its infrastructure. He knew which ridges blocked radio signals and which valleys held on to the morning mist the longest. He was not a tourist or a casual hiker. He was a professional who moved through the wilderness with the cold, calculated confidence of an engineer. This makes the nature of his departure all the more jarring for the community of Oakhaven. The timeline of February 11th was reconstructed with agonizing detail, yet it offered no clarity. Elias had clocked in at 7 a.m., attending a safety briefing before heading out to service a series of remote At 1:15 p.m., he stopped at a local diner for a turkey sandwich and coffee, where the waitress noted he seemed perfectly normal, even joking about the upcoming high school basketball playoffs. Elias checked his watch and headed north toward the deep woods. At 3:45 p.m., his GPS pings showed him arriving at the final substation of the day. He completed the maintenance log, electronically signing off on the work at 4:12 p.m. According to his route, he should have been home by 5:30 p.m., but at 4:30 p.m., a neighbor saw his truck driving at a very low speed down a road that was in the opposite direction of his home. The neighbor, a retired teacher named Marcus Vance, noted that Elias didn't wave back, which was uncharacteristic. Marcus claimed that Elias was leaning forward over the steering wheel, looking intensely at the trees to his right, as if he were searching for a specific landmark or an animal that had darted into the brush. The first real contradiction in the evidence appeared when the digital forensics team analyzed Elias's cell phone. Between 4:15 p.m. and 4:45 p.m., the phone recorded 3 outgoing calls, each lasting exactly 4 seconds. The calls were not to his wife, his office, or any contact in his directory. They were to a defunct landline number that had belonged to a local fire lookout tower that had been decommissioned and torn down in the late 1990s. When investigators tried to explain this, they were met with a technical impossibility. The tower's number had never been reassigned, and the physical copper lines to that location had been severed years ago. Yet, the phone's log was undeniable. While this was happening, a delivery driver on a nearby highway reported seeing a flash of blue light over the forest canopy in the general direction of Elias's last known location. The driver described it not as a firework or a flare, but as a static shimmer, like a television screen flickering in a dark room. By the time the sheriff's deputies reached Elias's idling truck at 8 p.m., the light was gone. The calls were silent, and the snow was beginning to bury the 12 steps he had taken into the unknown. As the deputies stood on that dark road, they noted a series of details that would become the foundation of the mystery. The heater in the truck was not just it was set to its maximum capacity, making the interior of the cab sweltering despite the open door. Elias's heavy winter jacket was still draped over the back of the driver's seat. For a man to step out into a Michigan February in only a flannel shirt and work boots suggested an extreme level of urgency or a total lack of concern for the elements. His boots had left deep, clear impressions in the fresh powder. They followed a straight line from the door toward the center of the road. There was no hesitation in the stride, no sign that he had turned around or looked back. The steps simply stopped. Beyond the 12th footprint, the snow was perfectly smooth, unbroken by any weight. It was as if he had been lifted directly upward or had vanished between one footfall and the next. The deputies called out his name into the trees, but the only response was the low moan of the wind through the pines and the steady, mechanical rattle of the truck's engine. The initial search was massive, involving over 100 volunteers, canine units, and thermal imaging drones. The Michigan winter, however, is a formidable adversary. The snow continued to fall, filling in any potential tracks and masking the scent for the dogs. The canine units behaved strangely near the spot where Elias's tracks ended. Instead of picking up a trail and moving forward, the dogs would reach the final footprint and then begin to circle frantically, some whimpering and refusing to move further into the woods. One handler reported that his dog, a seasoned Serchandrescu German shepherd, sat down at the end of the trail and began to howl at the sky, a behavior he had never seen in years of field work. The searchers moved deep into the Manistee forest, scouring ravines and frozen creek beds, but found nothing. No torn clothing, no dropped tools, no biological evidence of any kind. It was as if Elias had not walked into the woods, but had simply stopped being a physical presence in them. The investigation turned its focus to the people in Elias's life, looking for a fracture that might explain a sudden departure. Sarah Thorne was questioned extensively, not as a suspect, but as the person who saw the man behind the professional mask. She described the days leading up to his disappearance as quietly intense. Elias had become obsessed with his logs at work, cross-referencing power fluctuations in the Blackwood County sector with the times he heard the hum in their home. He had drawn a map of the county, but instead of marking roads or towns, he had marked dead zones, places where his work radio would cut out or where the static became unbearable. He had told her that he felt like he was tuning a radio every time he walked through the forest. When investigators looked at this map, they found that the spot where his truck was discovered was the exact center of a circle he had drawn in red ink. This suggested that his presence on that logging road was not accidental, but the result of a deliberate, perhaps obsessive, search. Amidst the official search, local tensions began to flare. In small communities like Oak Haven, a disappearance is often viewed through the lens of local history and old grudges. Suspicion naturally, and perhaps unfairly, fell on a local man named Garrett Howe. Howe lived in a cabin not far from where the truck was found, and had a history of trespassing disputes with the power company. Locals reported that Elias and Howe had a heated exchange a month prior regarding an easement on Howe's property. When questioned, Howe was evasive, claiming he had been asleep at the time of the disappearance. He had no alibi, and his behavior during the search was described as watchful. He would stand at the edge of his property, leaning on a shovel, silently observing the volunteers. However, a thorough search of Howe's cabin and land yielded nothing. There was no physical evidence linking him to Elias, and without a body or a crime scene, the suspicious neighbor remained a red herring that only served to frustrate the family and the police. The investigation took a more technical turn when the utility company's internal servers were examined. It was discovered that in the 3 days prior to his disappearance, Elias had accessed historical maintenance records from the 1950s. He was looking for reports of unexplained interference. In the Blackwood sector, he had printed out a report from 1958 that detailed a similar incident, where a line crew had reported hearing voices over their radios that sounded like they were coming from under the ground. The report had been dismissed at the time as atmospheric skip or a prank, but Elias had highlighted it in yellow. On the margin he had written a single word, harmonics. When the lead investigator, Detective Miller, asked a physics professor at a nearby university what that might mean in this context, the professor could only speculate that Elias was looking for a physical cause for a sensory experience trying to find the science behind the hum. As the weeks turned into months, the search efforts began to wind down, leaving a void that the town filled with speculation. The stranger involvement theory was explored, with detectives checking every vehicle that had passed through the county's automated toll systems or been captured on gas station cameras. They found nothing out of the ordinary. No mysterious black SUVs, no out-of-state plates that couldn't be accounted for. The logging road, where Elias disappeared, was a dead end. It led only to the deep woods and the decommissioned fire tower site. If someone had taken him, they would have had to pass Marcus Vance's house, and Marcus was adamant that only Elias's truck had gone up that road that afternoon. The lack of tire tracks from another vehicle in the fresh snow confirmed this. Whoever or whatever Elias encountered on that road, he had encountered it alone. The official theories began to crystallize, though none could comfortably house all the facts. The first theory was the most logical. An accident. Authorities suggested that Elias might have seen something, perhaps a downed line or an injured animal, and stepped out to investigate, only to suffer a medical emergency like a stroke or a sudden heart attack, falling into a snowdrift or a hidden sinkhole. But this didn't explain the missing footprints or the idling truck. If he had fallen, he would be where the tracks ended. The second theory involved voluntary disappearance. Investigators looked into the possibility that Elias was leading a double life, perhaps planning to vanish and start over. They scoured his bank accounts and internet history, looking for the odd habit that might signal a hidden motive. They found that in the 6 months prior, Elias had been visiting local archives, looking up old topographical maps of the county from the 1920s. He had been particularly interested in lost road trails that had been reclaimed by the forest nearly a century ago. Why a power technician would be obsessed with non-existent roads was never explained, but there was no evidence of a secret bank account or a second identity. One of the most unsettling aspects of the case emerged during a secondary search in the spring. After the snow had melted, a volunteer found Elias's work clipboard approximately half a mile from the truck, deep in a cedar swamp that was notoriously difficult to navigate. The clipboard was undamaged, but the papers it held were blank. Not just blank, but as if they had never been written on. The electronic maintenance logs Elias had signed at 4:12 p.m. were still in the system, but the physical copies he was known to keep as backups were devoid of ink. A forensic analysis showed no trace of graphite or ink ever being applied to the pages. This contradicted the testimony of his supervisor, who had seen Elias writing on those very pages earlier that morning. This detail, kept from the public for years, led to internal discussions about environmental anomalies, though no official report would use such a term. The case took another turn when a local amateur radio operator, who had been monitoring the frequencies in the Blackwood area, came forward with a recording. He claimed that at 4:42 p.m. on the day Elias vanished, he had picked up a signal that consisted of a rhythmic, low-frequency pulsing. Overlaid on this pulse was a sound that he described as metallic whispering. He couldn't decipher any words, but the cadence sounded like a man reciting a series of numbers. When the recording was played for Sarah Thorne, she became visibly shaken. She couldn't confirm it was Elias, but she said the rhythm of the speech matched the way he used to count out loud when he was working on complex wiring diagrams. The recording was sent to the FBI for analysis, but the results were inconclusive. They claimed the audio was too distorted by magnetic interference to provide a positive identification. By the one-year anniversary, the case had gone cold. The official search had been called off, and the forest had reclaimed the logging road where the truck had been found. But the questions remained, festering in the minds of those left behind. Why was the heater left on in a Michigan winter? Any local knows that if you're leaving your vehicle for more than a minute, you conserve fuel or shut it down to prevent stalling in the cold. The idling engine suggested Elias expected to be back within seconds. And then there was the matter of the unexplained object. 2 years after the disappearance, a hiker found Elias's wedding ring. It wasn't buried in the woods or hidden in a cabin. It was found sitting perfectly level on top of a concrete survey marker nearly 10 miles from where the truck had been discovered. The ring showed no signs of weathering, despite having supposedly been in the elements for 24 months. The gold was polished, the inscription inside still crisp. It was as if someone had just placed it there minutes before the hiker arrived. The location where the ring was found on that survey marker was significant. It was the exact spot where the fire lookout tower had stood decades ago. This was the same tower Elias had seemingly tried to call in his final moments. When investigators returned to the site, they found that the ground around the marker was strangely barren. Even in the height of summer, no weeds or grass grew within a 3-foot radius of the concrete block. Soil samples were taken, but they showed no chemical toxins or radiation. The land was simply ... empty. It was a detail that added another layer of the unsettling to an already cold case. Was the ring a message, or was it a leftover? A piece of a man that the forest had decided to return. The psychological impact on the town of Oak Haven cannot be overstated. For years, the story of Elias Thorne has served as a dark campfire tale, but for the Thorne family, it is a living ghost. Sarah Thorne eventually moved away, unable to look at the pines without seeing the husband who never came home. But before she left, she reported one final, chilling occurrence. She had been cleaning out the attic when she found Elias's old acoustic equipment, the sensors he had used to track the hum. She turned one on, just to see if it still worked. The needle on the frequency monitor immediately spiked into the red, and the small speaker emitted a sound that Sarah could only describe as a sob trapped in static. She smashed the device with a hammer and left the house that same afternoon, leaving most of her belongings behind. As the years pass, the theories remain as stagnant as the waters of the cedar swamp. Some believe Elias was the victim of a voluntary disappearance, gone wrong that he had planned to meet someone at the old tower site and was killed, his body hidden in one of the many deep ravines that scarred the county. But the lack of evidence makes this hard to sustain. Others lean toward the foul play theory, suggesting that Garrett Howe or someone like him finally snapped. Yet, without a body, the sheriff's department cannot bring charges. Then there are the fringe theories, the ones whispered in the local diner about thin spots in the world and the blue light seen by the delivery driver. These theories suggest that Elias didn't go anywhere, that he is still on that road, just in a way that we can no longer perceive. The case of Elias Thorne remains one of Michigan's most unsettling mysteries because it lacks the violence that usually accompanies such stories. There is no blood to point to a crime, no note to point to a suicide, and no sighting to point to a new life. There is only an empty truck, a door left open to the cold, and a set of footprints that lead to a sudden, silent end. Investigators still occasionally review the file, looking at the photos of the 12 steps in the snow, trying to understand what Elias saw in those final seconds that made him leave the warmth of his cab. Was he following someone? Was he running towards something, or was he simply answering a call that no one else could hear? The most haunting detail of all, however, didn't come from the police reports or the witness statements. It came from the final log entry on Elias's work computer, found months into the investigation. He had created a file titled The Hum. Analysis. The final line of the document, time-stamped at 3:15 a.m. the day he disappeared, simply read, "It isn't a sound, it's a door." To this day, the decommissioned fire tower's line remains silent, and the woods of Blackwood County keep their secrets buried under layers of pine needles and snow. No theory has ever been confirmed. No trace of Elias Thorne has ever been found since the ring appeared on that survey marker. The forest remains, the road remains, and the questions remain, hanging in the air like the Michigan fog, thick and impossible to see through. We are left to wonder if the answers are hidden in the trees, or if they are somewhere much further away, in the silent zones Elias was so desperate to understand. What happened in those 12 steps? Perhaps the truth is something we aren't meant to find, a glitch in the quiet life of a man who was simply doing his job. The silence of Okavin continues, but for those who know the story, it is never truly quiet. There is always the hum, just beneath the threshold of hearing, waiting for the next person to step off the road.